Hi, I'm Carolyn Jones with the Office of Foster Care Licensing, and welcome to another workshop on the web. This evening we're going to be talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act. Imagine being torn from the land of your ancestors, where they have walked for thousands of years, and being placed in a place where you wouldn't hear the language that you had grown up with, and being placed in a home where you don't look like the rest of the folks in that home. Such was the fate of children, Indian children, in our foster care system in the 1950s. This evening we are joined by Mary Ross, who is a member of the Muckleshoot tribe here in Western Washington and a former foster child in our system. She's a grandmother of a 9-year-old. And with her is her sister Donna Starr, who is a retired nurse and Indian activist, who is a former foster child and was Muckleshoot Grandmother of the Year last year. They're going to share with us what it actually was like to be in care in the 1950s in Washington State. We also are joined by Charlene Ramirez, who is a program manager for quality assurance with Children's Administration and a member of the Hidatsa tribe of North Dakota. And finally, we're joined by Paula Benz, our chief of the Office of Foster Care Licensing, who is a member of the Gros Ventre tribe of Fort Belknap, Montana. We're going to start by asking Donna and Mary to share with us their experience of foster care in the 1950s. And we want to say thank you for being here to share this walk with us. Tell us about how that came about, how old you were, and what that felt like.
Donna startsidsta to Alchid Muckleshoot. My name is Donna Starr, and I'm from Muckleshoot. Gualapusi Iab de Ishid, Gualapusi Iab de Ishid. We thank you for this gathering that we could all come together today. It's good for us to come together and discuss these kinds of things, to talk together. And in speaking our Holshutsi language, or anytime I get a chance to use the language on this land, I try to use it because our land was almost, I think we had 6 people speaking our language when I started learning it. And they were all over the age of 60, so I try to share that language with anyone that I can. So I introduce myself in our Holshutsi language today. I was 12 years old when I was taken from my parents, and I was the oldest daughter of my folks, and so I had mostly the responsibility and was very bonded to my brothers and sisters. I thought, I was really afraid that we were going to be taken and separated from my siblings like my cousins were. I had some close cousins that were taken. They were all in different homes, but we ended up in one foster home all together. And I still remember that day. It was really in the summertime, and the sun was shining and everything, and my folks went out to pick strawberries. That's how they made their living. And I was the oldest one, so I was watching my younger brothers and sisters, and pretty soon Mom and them came home. They told me to have the kids all bathed up and cleaned up, and they didn't tell us where we were going. And when they came home from work, and they told us we had to get in the car, we were going to Seattle, and we went to Seattle, and we had to sit out in the car in the sunshine and wait. And then when Mom and Dad came out, they told us we were going to go live with some other people. And we went to live with the Robertsons, and we knew them before that because they were the minister and his wife of the little Pentecostal church on our reservation. And so we knew them, but it was really hard for me, and I tried to be strong for my younger brothers and sisters so they wouldn't be afraid. But I was really hurting inside. and they took us to their home, and they were really nice to start out with. They were nice to us, and mostly my foster mother's parents were really nice. We got attached to them right away, and we were all able to stay together, but it was just really too hard, and I missed my mother and dad so much, and I knew where I belonged. I knew, and we were always taught to remember whose blood runs through our veins. And so I knew my folks and my grandparents, and I knew I was Muckleshoot, and that was important to me. And I clung to those things and always remembered Mom and Dad, and they were limited to the times that they could see us, and eventually our foster parents kept us away from them altogether and moved us to Eastern Washington, and as soon as I turned 18, though, I said, I'm going back where I came from. I know where I belong. I know who my parents are. And they knew I was older and that they wouldn't be able to change my name or convince me that they were my parents and that I didn't have other parents. They weren't able to convince me of that. And then I left and went away to nursing school in New Mexico. And so then my younger siblings were there, and I felt like in an unprotected situation, kind of. And so I left there and went away to nursing school and went to New York from there. So I'll let my sister talk a little bit more about after I left. Mary.
I'm Mary Ross. This is hard to talk about. I was taken away from my mom and dad when I was 3 years old, and I remember going to Seattle and going, I didn't know where we were going, but we all got to be together. And we still lived in Muckleshoot, but then pretty soon they said, we're moving you to Tonasket where you guys won't see your mom and dad. You don't have a mom and dad. We're going to be your mommy and daddy now. You call us mommy and daddy. I had a lot of things happen that I protected myself. I didn't know what my sisters were going through. I just wondered in my mind all the time, are they all right? But I protected myself. And I was very happy today we got to see her mom and dad. They found Tonasket and they came up to visit us. And after that they came up quite often. I feel like our foster family, in a way, they've done us good. Things that they done to us that weren't very nice, that I didn't know I could report to DSHS. We never did see a caseworker. When I moved back home with my mom and dad after a bunch of I don't know how to say it. Sexual abuse happened, and my youngest sister and I got taken out of that foster home, put in a group home in Okanagan. We were in there for quite a while before we got to move home with Mom and Dad. But there was bad things that happened. I try to focus on the good things. And I try to tell children today, you know, if you're in a foster home or whatever you report, if you're being physically abused, sexually abused, verbally abused, let somebody know. Because I didn't know that when I was a child, that we could report it to somebody. And I put up with physical abuse for a long time. But I thank them for the way they taught us about Jesus, about religion. I feel like that took care of me all of my years.
How was it to be an Indian child in a community where everyone else was white? Was there any kind of prejudice that you perceived, or any kind of...
We lived in Tenascan. It was a good community.
It was a nice community.
I didn't know we was by an Indian reservation over there, so...
So there was no attempt made to
No attempt.
connect you kids with your culture, even if it were with a different tribe.
They kept trying to keep us from that.
They felt that they needed to change that in
us.
you, take that away.
Try to change us, but that's here, and you can't take
In your
that.
heart, you knew who you were. Right, right. So this is the backdrop that brings us then to the creation of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I'm going to ask Charlene to kind of talk to us about how the Act came about and how it now drives our professional practice in child welfare in the state.
The Indian Child Welfare Act wasn't passed until 1978, but prior to that, there was attempts in Washington State to ensure protections for Indian children, special requirements for Indian children entering the foster care system. And that was in 1976. And what happened is the tribes in Washington, it's been, for me being from North Dakota, it's been a real privilege and honor to work with the people in this state, the Indian people and the tribal people in this state, because really what they did was build a model for the federal law. The basic provisions of the Washington Administrative Code were used as the model for the federal law. Provisions such as notification of tribe when you have an Indian child in care. And even before I talk about the provisions, you have to talk about what is an Indian child. And we have different definitions of Indian child in Washington State. Federal law is probably the most stringent in terms of definition. It's essentially a child who's the biological child of a tribal member and is eligible for enrollment and or membership in a federally recognized tribe. And beyond that, in Washington State, there's a Washington Administrative Code definition which includes unenrolled and which includes Canadian Indian children. So it's a little bit more broad for Washington State provisions than it is for federal law. But our laws mandate that we make attempts to identify Indian children that are coming into care, contact their tribe, make a family placement, a placement with a member of the child's family or tribe or Indian community, and lastly, non-Indian family. We also have provisions now under federal law to require us to give notice to the tribe immediately so that they can intervene in state court proceedings. We also recognize and give good faith and credit to tribal court orders. If a child comes into care, you need to contact that tribe, not only for the purpose of asking if they want to be a party to the proceeding or take jurisdiction, but for the purpose of ensuring that there is no current petition in tribal court, because if there is, we wouldn't be petitioning in state court except under some emergent circumstances. There are other provisions under state law as well that provide protections for Indian children: the placement preference, the notification, the ability to intervene as a party to a proceeding. And a tribe can do that at any point in the proceeding. But the main
thrust of all of this is basically to return the right to determine a child's best interest to the tribe and to Indian people. Because throughout our history, it has been basically governmental intervention that has led to so much disruption of Indian families over the years. We've had the boarding school experience, which most of us in our grandmother's generation and great-grandmother's generation was mandatory for them to attend boarding school away from home from the age of 5, sometimes until the age of 18. Some children died while they were at boarding school. And this led to a lot of disruption of all of these really strong community parenting practices that were traditionally in place. It led to abuse in these boarding schools, and it led to a major need to start to look at what's best for Indian children from an Indian perspective. It would be like, I think it's equivalent to Indian tribes are sovereign nations, and it would be like having Canada come and determine the best interests for U.S. children. And so the reason for the federal law and the Indian child welfare provisions was to basically return that right to determine children's best interests back to the tribal community. And that's what it does. It offers protections to ensure that that occurs. Right along with economic self-sufficiency, we also have to recognize that tribes don't have any future if you don't have your children. And so it was a major effort to stop the unwarranted removal of Indian children. The Association of American Indian Affairs did a survey, I think it was the early 70s, and learned that 35% of Indian children were in some type of out-of-home care. So we were at a real crisis for tribes, because, I mean, if you can imagine the United States having 35% of their children somewhere else in care in Canada, that's pretty startling. And, I mean, it means the future of our nations. So that was the reason for, some of the reasons for the special provisions in the Indian Child Welfare Act and the passage of those protections.
And the act did not come into being without a great deal of lobbying and advocacy on the part of the Indian community. Maybe you could speak to that, Donna. Are you aware, or were you involved at all at that point?
I was involved in Muckleshoots when Muckleshoot had the first Indian tribal group home I think in the U.S., I think. And so we were involved in that, in trying to keep our children in the community. And I think Marie Starr, my sister-in-law, was heavily involved in that. I was mostly in the health area, but I served on the Indian Child Welfare Committee for Muckleshoot.
Wonderful.
At the time. But I know that there was many tribal leaders who were very concerned about those.
And so today we have a number of tribes who are private child placing agencies and actually are able to keep the children in the community. Would you talk to us, Paula, about how that comes about through our office and how that drives what we do?
Yes, well, the Division of Licensed Resources licenses foster homes. We also tribes can certify their homes, and then we license the homes. So the tribes can license their own homes, and they can actually place children in their homes without, if they assert tribal jurisdiction, so that the state may not even be involved in the placements of those children, but we are involved in the licensing of those homes. With the homes that are licensed through the Division of Licensed Resources through the state, we work with foster parents to identify whether they are Native American. When a foster home gets a home study, part of the home study would include asking that foster parent if they are Native American and what their tribal affiliation is. And that way we can be helpful so that when the Division of Children and Family Services makes a placement of an Indian child, we can identify which homes would be Native American. Realizing that we don't have enough Native American homes, so we will and do place Indian children still in non-Indian foster homes. Charlene mentioned the percentages of Indians in foster care. In Washington State, we actually have, our children are 2% of the population and they're 12% in care. So our state actually has a lower percentage of Indian children in care, but still that's quite high. Mm-hmm. So there is a need for foster parents to take care of Indian children. And it really is our responsibility, however, that when a social worker makes a placement, that they know what type of home that they're placing a child in, whether it's Indian or non-Indian. And then we also like to encourage the foster home to keep the child involved with their own tribe and family if possible, so they keep that connection in whatever way that they can.
So if I'm a member of the Passamaquoddy tribe, and I happen to be living in the Seattle area, would I be ineligible to foster a child from a differing tribe?
No, you would not be ineligible. What the social worker would do would be to contact the child's tribe, and initially they would look for relatives. If relatives are not available, they would look for a tribal placement, and if the tribal placement wasn't available, then they would look for the next preference, which would be an Indian foster home. So the social worker would communicate to the tribe and let them know what type of home you were, and the tribe can make a decision based on the best interests of the child.
I see. Okay, thank you. So if you had a magic wand, Mary and Donna, what would have helped in your situation? What could have made that situation better for you?
I wish they wouldn't have took us from Muckleshoot. Mm-hmm. Wish we could have stayed there. I could have learned my language.
That sounds like a real personal loss for you, mm-hmm. not to have learned that language, because you were so tiny mm-hmm. when you were removed. Yeah.
It was like they was trying to brainwash us that it's bad to be Indian, and it's not bad.
Oh, not at all, no. So. Isn't that really what the act intended to eradicate? Was this notion that someone couldn't be who they are, that the culture...
The governmental policies, I mean, it's too detailed and lengthy to go into each individual policy, but that led to the disruption of our families, but it was that major thrust towards assimilation, and there was a relocation and taking families from the reservation, well, offering incentives, money and jobs off reservation in the cities so that people would relocate, leave the communities and reservations, and become part of dominant society. But what actually occurred was people felt isolated, and a lot of issues surfaced around the boarding school situation and the lack of having your normal community, your normal family unit. It was an institution, and it was run by the government, and it was many times a religious order, because there was no separation of church and state. So it was a very unnatural family situation, and it was a very painful situation, and sometimes they would withhold food to get parents to give up their children and put them in these boarding schools, so we've missed a good couple generations of these efforts to try and assimilate Indian people. But even now, you know, we're still returning home. People are getting educated and returning home to their communities. And even if you don't, you probably are pretty connected to your tribal community, even if you do live off reservation.
Donna, do you have any thoughts on what, from your perspective, the system should do to improve, even today, with the existence of current law, the services to Indian children?
I think that the caseworker needs to and should have a monthly, if not more, connection with the child and monitor the home and make sure that everything's being, ask the child if everything's going, you know, and have some time with that child by themselves and see how things are going. The other thing would be to keep the children connected to their community in some way. Tribes have tribal newsletters. They have all the different services, health services, dental services, all of those things are available to the child, and they should be able to utilize their own community's services that are there, and to help the children to know who their relatives are, who their community are, and help them to stay connected that way. Because, you know, foster parents they have originally, ours had the best things in their heart to be foster parents, and it turned out to be a tragedy for my younger sisters. And but I think that the foster parents need to be monitored much more closely than has been in our area.
In your time,
in my
in
time.
care. And today, of course, we have a requirement that there's a health and safety check to be done every minimum of 90 days. So that if a child is in care, one of our people should be coming out to visit with that child and to assess in the home if everything is okay. We have a question that's been posed here by someone who is interested in knowing more about foster care. I'm a Canadian First Nation. Can I have a placement? Do I get licensed through a tribe or through DSHS? What can I do to help? Paula or Charlene, either of you would like to field that question?
I'm assuming you live in Washington State. If you live in Washington State, you can be licensed through, depending on where you live, you could actually be licensed through a tribe, child placing agency, or you could contact the state and be licensed as a foster home. And when we come out and do our the home study, we would talk with you about your background and get verification, and then when we write up the home study, we would let it be known that if you were interested in taking Indian children as placements, then we would put that in the home study, and we would furnish that information to social workers. It would be available to social workers, and sometimes tribes borrow homes from us for placements. So yes, you could take Indian children and get licensed either through a tribe or a private agency or through state offices.
Very good. And we appreciate your inquiry because we need homes for all of our children. I wanted to ask Donna, here's a question from someone, why should I identify myself as American Indian? Maybe you could respond to that question and help that person to understand how important that is in their life.
We're taught, we've always been taught and received teachings that we are to remember who we are, whose blood runs through your veins, who your relatives are. Anytime an Indian meets another Indian on the street and they introduce themselves, they don't just say, I'm Donna Starr and I'm from Auburn. You say, I'm Donna Starr. I'm from the Muckleshoot tribe. My grandmother was. My grandfather and grandmother on this side was. That's, you know, that's important for you to hang on to those things and it's important to be who you are. It's- You'll be whole. You'll be whole when you.
I think with the law now that the DUCFS social workers are required to, if they have an Indian child, to get the child enrolled if the child is not enrolled, and then assist with that connection with the tribe. And I guess from listening to Donna and Mary's story, I think it's important for people to consider when they're thinking about Indian children in foster care, and if they are in a non-Indian foster home, that foster care is for a distinct period of time in a child's life. Once a child is 18, they're no longer a foster child. And once they are Indian and they're always going to be Indian, that community is always going to be there. And it's so important to give them a connection that they really have a right to, and to have that connection for their entire life, and have those connections with community, and have the history, and know where they come from. And I think one of the things that I've learned through the state and working with Indian children is that particularly at adolescence, it's such an important time for a child to know their background and where they came from, to know a little bit about really who they are, so that they can become who they are.
There are a lot of foster homes, both Indian and non-Indian foster homes, that I think really want to help and really want to be available for children. And I think sometimes they stay away because they think if you're non-Indian you can't take Indian children, but the reality is we will never have enough, sadly, enough foster homes. And we have to place outside of family, outside of tribe, outside of community. And I think if there's one thing that people could remember if they do have an Indian child in their care, it's to learn who that child is, really is. Not just that they're an Indian child, but what their tribe is, and what their history is, and what their culture is about. And there's so many Indian children, I think, and Indian adults for that matter, walking around who don't have a good appreciation for all of our contributions. And I hear, this is kind of crazy, but I hear on CNN constantly people taking credit for democracy. Well, that was an Indian form of government. That's where it came from. And I know that, unless you really dig and you really learn about a particular child's background and culture, you're not going to be able to give them what they need to connect and to feel good about themselves, because there's too many negative stereotypes out there. And it's very difficult, I think, to get good information. You have to find good resources and good people who you can contact that can help you through these systems to get that information.
Where would you, we have a couple of resources that are posted to our web, but where would you generally recommend someone to turn to get information, genealogical information, historical information about the leaders historically of a particular tribe, that sort of thing?
I think you have to figure out what area the child's from, if you don't know the tribe, where the grandparents might have been born, or what area they were from. And then you can always contact a tribe within that area. You can contact the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're pretty easy to find under federal government. If you want information about events, if you want information about important things in Indian country, there's a website that I really like and go into a lot. It's called indians.com. And there's a lot of information about what's happening currently with land issues, with laws, with the recent federal suit and probate issues. And there's a lot of information about what's happening in local tribal communities. But I think it's real important not just to take those stereotypes but to find out about their contributions and to teach that to these children so that they can grow up knowing how unique and special they are.
This is true. When we talk in Pride pre-service for our incoming foster parents, we talk about the importance of connecting children to relationships that will last a lifetime. And so this is one of those competencies that the state of Washington committed themselves to when we adopted the Child Welfare League's curriculum for foster parent education. We know that when we're dealing with African American children or Latino children, that if we're not of that particular culture, we need to get next to that culture. I mean, would you think that that's doable? Do you see the Native community, the Indian community, as being opening to non-Indian people who are endeavoring to bring the kids close to the community? Is that something that it would be welcomed by tribes? Donna?
I think it would be.
In the name of
Yeah.
getting kids to
Right.
be part of their community and their heritage.
When I was a foster home licenser, this was a long time ago, we had some kids who were in care. They were Canadian Indian, and they were in an Indian home, but it was not a Canadian Indian home. And one of the children had been in this particular home for about 3 or 4 years, so she had been there for a while, and she had a really difficult history, very seriously abused child. And when the tribe, it was a very small tribe, we had to, well anyway, they intervened. They intervened on the case. They wanted to be involved and be involved in the placement where they hadn't been involved prior. And they wanted to, they had identified some relatives that they were interested in placing the child with. And so they asked to come see us to come bring the child to their village and meet the child, and then the relatives would visit and decide, kind of get an idea of the child and what they thought. And so we spent the day there in the village, and it was very interesting. The foster parent came along, and of course she was very nervous because she thought, oh gee, you know, I'm going to lose this child. This child is like my daughter. This is my daughter. And all day long people would come and they'd say hello, and they would go back and talk in the other room, and this kept happening, and we didn't know what would happen. But we gave them all the information. We gave them all the information about the child and her circumstances, and we finished the day. They put us back on the plane, and we left. And a week or so later, they called and they said that they had some family that were interested, but when they saw how well the girl was doing there and how attached, they wanted the child to stay in this foster home. But they also provided the foster home with a connection to come and be with, to come visit, to spend time there, be involved. They showed her how to make their traditional dress. So it was really a good connection. And I guess that's an important point, that the tribes make decisions about children based on the best interests of the child.
Of the child,
Yeah.
rather than their need to control. Yeah, that's great. That's really the way it's supposed to be, isn't it?
And I think if you give tribes information early on, up front, and you don't wait, they're more apt to think that, you know, you're being honest with them about the situation, because there's not a lot of trust for governmental agencies in the Indian community, and with good reason. But I think when you can give information early on, you can get a relationship established, and you have a better chance of a better outcome. And even when that can't happen, sometimes you don't know you have an Indian child in care. There are situations, I know a case where we only recently learned we were working with an Indian child at the time of the relinquishment, and it had been a couple years down the road, and the father turned out to be Indian, and I know the worker was extremely concerned because the siblings were non-Indian, and all 3 siblings were with the maternal grandparents. And I think they were concerned that the tribe would just remove the Indian sibling and place with, other relatives from the tribe, and then the other siblings would have to be in another placement. And that isn't what happened at all. They gave them all the necessary information, and they did consider the situation, and they established a contact similar to what Paula mentioned occurred in that case, and they were able to keep the siblings with the maternal grandparents, but became very connected to their tribal community and their other relatives as well.
Which is important. Talk to me for a minute about the Trail of Tears, the relocation of many of the tribes that were southeastern originally. We have a lot of folks who will say that I know that I'm Cherokee, but I don't know specifically where. They're not able to necessarily give the genealogical information. And so how has that affected our identification of Indian children?
Well, we are able to verify fairly easily if you have a tribe that tribal name, tribal affiliation you can actually identify with. Where it gets difficult is if you don't have that. And a lot of people, I think that they're part Cherokee. I think that's just the reality. But you can contact them directly, and you can establish whether or not there is a descendant on their enrollment or membership rolls. And it's pretty easy to do. You don't have to have a lot of information. You might need a grandparent name or a great-grandparent's name, and then you might have to establish relationship to that person through death certificates and birth certificates. But it's not an impossibility. It can take some time sometimes, but you can make phone calls. You can contact the tribe directly. But if you have a tribal affiliation, it's not that difficult. And it doesn't take quite as much time as it would if you had somebody saying, I think I'm Indian, but I have no idea what tribe.
Yeah. And that often happens too.
Sure.
I think our workers do make an effort, but it's very difficult to nail down the specifics. And unless you have that genealogical connection, it's very difficult. Let's talk about the Interstate Compact. How does that play into tribal situations? Suppose we have a child here in Washington State that is enrollable within the Seminole Nation. Is that something that just goes our state to the tribe, or does that go through Interstate Compact as other cases would, non-Indian cases? How would we begin the process, perhaps, if the tribe wanted to be a party and actually wanted to offer domicile to the child? How would we work that through?
Interstate Compact is only in place because of the money or the services that can follow. Tribes don't necessarily have to become a member of the compact. It's not necessary. But if they wanted resources for the child, if they wanted services for the child that maybe they didn't have the funds to provide, then we would probably go through the Interstate Compact process. But legally, they can petition to take jurisdiction, intervene in or take jurisdiction of a proceeding, and the compact wouldn't necessarily even apply.
I see. Okay, so that's certainly something that can make it a longer process if it is involved. Yeah,
it could. And we don't have much information on tribes that have become members of the compact, but it's something that's an option, and it's pretty much dependent upon the need for services for the child.
Well, and so many of our children do need services, and very often those are expensive services that may not be readily available in that particular community, and so then that really is that the tribe is then taking on an enormous financial responsibility.
Right. It could be a big benefit in some cases.
Yeah. Let's talk a minute about some of the milestones that happen within the Indian community for children, so that our audience has a greater understanding of some of those important milestones that that kids need to have to grow to fullness in who they are. In your tribe, Charlene, were there particular observances or milestones or events that took place?
Oh, well, every tribe is different. There's naming ceremonies. There's a number of different ceremonies, but we also have 3 tribes on my reservation. We're known as the 3 affiliated tribes. So we have kind of a emergence of 3 tribal practices. So it would be hard to just rattle off practices in terms of milestones for children because we're
Every
3
tribe
tribes.
is different.
Yeah.
Is there something in particular in the Muckleshoot tribe that the kids experience that help in that understanding of who they are? Or is that just a daily thing that kind of gets inculcated from the early stages of understanding?
Well, there's different things that that happens too, especially like teenagers. They're young boys. Their first hunting.
Okay.
The first deer that they kill, they have to share with all the community
Oh, really?
and deliver to an elder or to the elders of the tribe, and the same with their catch of fish, and there's the spirituality, the different ways that was the traditional ways of worshiping and receiving a song, receiving your Indian name, receiving a dance, you know, and those are the kinds of things that non-Indians aren't allowed into. That it's for the people, and but there are, you know, those kinds of things that I think that they gather all the time. Making their first drum, they have to give away.
Oh, the first drum?
Yeah, the first drum, hand drum. They make anything. The first thing they make, they have to give it to somebody else.
So that's good modeling for giving and sharing amongst the tribe. And that's the kind of stuff that was absent then in the BIA or in the boarding schools, where there wasn't that modeling necessarily.
Well, in the bureau, there wasn't any parenting.
Right,
Out
exactly.
to the kids, you know, and
Yeah.
they were marched to the dining hall, they were marched to the gym, they were marched here.
Right.
And if the kid fell down and skinned their knee, no one picked them up and said, "Oh, did you hurt yourself?" They were slapped with a ruler to tell them, "You're messing up the line. Get
Yeah.
up and get marching," you know. And so there was no nurturing, and
No
so
nurturing.
so the generations, you know, my folks and their and then their folks lived through a lot of
austerity, kind of, the kind of thing that we saw depicted in the orphanages of the 1800s in England. And yes, yes.
I think that was a similar experience. While the tribes are all different, that similar boarding house experience robbed them not only of their language, their culture, their hair, their spirit. I think one of the things that I know that is so different is the traditional parenting styles that the boarding schools serve to eradicate. In my tribe, the grandparents really raise the children, and they have their role. The parents go out and make the living, but the grandparents really, the children spend all their time with the grandparents, and the grandparents have a very important role. And as do the aunts and uncles have an important role. So there's a structure there that children got. And in my tribe, it was very structured, particularly around adolescence, which I think was a good thing. And all that was taken away. And so, like Donna said, and my grandmother was taken to boarding school when she was very young, and she talks about marching. You know, they marched here, they marched there. There was a whistle blown when you eat. There was a whistle blown when you stop eating. And if you can imagine children 6 years old in that kind of an environment where there's no as Donna said, nurturing. So,
Yeah, that's decimating. I mean, that just is, I can't imagine having to relinquish your child to that at age 5. Can you imagine what that was like for Indian parents? How your heart would just drop seeing that little one go out the door.
I don't think they knew the extent of it. I don't think they knew. Some of the generations that had been there had the experience themselves, so they knew. But I think initially, I can't imagine that they could envision anything that went on in these boarding schools, because they were military. They were run by the military, the United States government.
Yes, yes. And we know this happens, this has happened in Canada, it's happened in Australia. This is something that we, as in dominant culture, need to understand, and we need to own it. And we need to support efforts to remediate that and to help restore our Indian families to the level of parenting, and to supply them with whatever they need so that these parents, these new parents, can be restored and reinstitute the kinds of structure that you just referred to.
And as Indian people, we have to own it. We have to acknowledge that is the history, and that is something that we have to work to heal. And I look at, the information that's coming out now about the Catholic Church and the sex abuse, and you can't even imagine, our children living, our grandmas and our grandpas, and
Living with that.
living with that
horrendous
situation,
memory.
and what we're having to heal from. But until we talk about it and admit that this was what happened, and I have great faith, Indian people are survivors. I think if we have one gift, it's that we are survivors. And I think as long as we can acknowledge that this was the history and look at that history and figure out now what's a healthy parent look like. I remember being at an elders conference, and I remember one elder said, "You keep talking about mental health, mental health. What is mental health?" And I mean, these are just such basics for everybody else, and we just need to be able to come up with solutions, come up with answers, come up with things that work with Indian people, because we have such unique values, we have such a unique way of looking at life, such a unique way of communicating. It's a very different presentation, I think, than dominant society, and we have to figure out what fits for us and where we fit.
And in terms of educating kids, going on to college, gaining those clinical skills or those professional skills to come back to the community and to empower the community, then to be able to do what needs to be done so that everyone moves ahead. Do you recall any of your native language? Or have you been exposed to that? Or
We always, my grandma spoke fluent Hidatsa, and she used to have a friend she would call, and they would talk, and the only thing we ever learned was pretty much body parts and no swear words, but but they common things, like the way, I think the traditional way of parenting, for instance, was to allow somebody else to punish us. And the way they did that is they would say, like, the Dakobesh is coming, which meant the booger man is coming. So we knew those kinds of things, and we knew things like how to say sugar and my mom's Indian name. And
what was her Indian name?
Good Medicine.
Good Medicine. And the naming ceremony, who named you?
I don't have an Indian name.
You don't? Does anyone here have an Indian name?
When I was born, my mother took me to my dad's grandmother and put me in her arms, and she said, "This one is going to carry my name." And Mom died, and I don't know what the name is. I have some research I need to do, yeah.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful
To
thing
find out and then receive
know.
it, yeah.
Yes. How about you, Paula? Any language that you recall from your tribe?
No, my grandmother still speaks a little. She's still alive, and she talks about how there were people that spoke when she was young, and she could probably speak if there were other people to speak with. But our tribe also interacted with other tribes, so that most of the people were fluent in several different Indian languages, other tribes that they came into contact with.
Well, it's interesting that there's been a lot of intermarriage, has there not, between tribes as well? So very often, if you go, I believe I went by the Lummi Reservation this summer, sailing up there, and I noticed that there was a wigwam. They were having a gathering, and I distinctly thought that I understood that that was more of a Plains practice. But that, and then I think I talked with a friend of mine who is an Indian woman, and she said that, well, you know, there's a lot of back and forth now, and so that happens where you're finding an amalgamation of different kinds of symbols and practices. Is that, are you seeing that with Muckleshoot as well?
There are, yeah, a lot of practices that, you know, even the powwow isn't a coastal. It isn't a coastal. Our thing was mainly storytelling, you know, teaching through stories, and your own family dance or stick games, those kinds of things. It was a potlatch rather than, but now we have powwows, you know, 2 or 3 a year. I think Muckleshoot does,
Which is
and
more
they're big gatherings.
Plains practice?
Yeah.
And what are the Eastern Indians, the Eastern Coast? We're so far out here on the West Coast, but we've probably got viewers tonight from other places, and so how do they factor into things? Do we see that their practices have also found their way into other communities?
I think it's individual. If you have, I know that my nephew has married a Seminole, so I know Hidatsa practices are down in Florida, but I don't know about the reverse. Yeah, I think it would just depend on what kind of intermarriages have occurred and what kind of people are living in our communities and different tribes.
And I think that's a good point, you know, as this audience looks around this table and sees a variety of faces, a variety of skin tone and eye color. My eyes are darker than yours. And, you know, we all in this nation have melded together. And really that's, you know, kind of what America's been about. But we want to understand the oppression that Indian children have experienced, and I cannot offer enough thanks to Mary and to Donna tonight for coming and sharing their painful story with us, because that is oppression. What we have done to Indian children in our country, robbing them of their identity, their self-esteem, their language, is oppression. And when one person in America is oppressed, we are all oppressed. And so if you have an opportunity to open your home as an Indian home to a child, we would urge you to call us and let us know of your availability. If you are not an Indian person and willing to open your home to any child in the state's care, we would welcome your call as well. We want to thank those foster parents who are already on board serving children for opening their house and their hearts to the children. And please know that 100 years from now, it won't matter what kind of house you lived in, but if you've helped children, that is a legacy that will go on from generation to generation. Thank you for being with us, and join us again for another workshop on the web. Thank you, ladies, so much.